Hello, good morning, everyone. Honorable Member of the European Parliament, Dominic Ruiz de Vesa, dear participants, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this event at the European Parliament on the ensuring integrity of the European Parliament elections 2024 through the participation of civil society. My name is Armin Rabic, and I have the pleasure today to be your moderator. The 2024 elections are crucial. We have seen a backsliding of democracy all across the European Union, and especially in some of its member states, where we also see elections this autumn. It is on the European decision makers, it's on the MEPs to bring to the attention of the governments and to the attention of the election management bodies that reforms are still possible ahead of the 2024 elections. We as civil society have conducted 4 webinars and come up with a policy paper including recommendations on accountability, inclusion, transparency and equality, and how best to implement reforms ahead of the European Parliament elections. It is for us to bridge this gap, and that's why we're here, between active European citizens and European decision makers. And we want to reinforce 3 crucial aspects of the European elections. That's the integrity of the elections, the democratic participation, and the human rights resilience. It is my pleasure to hand over now to the hosting MEP, Dominic Ruiz de Vesa,
the European Parliament. As Amin mentioned, I am the rapporteur of the European Parliament on the new European electoral law. And I am also the co-rapporteur for a new report that we will be approving later in the year on the 2024 elections. So for us, it is very clear that the European elections are, of course, now a established feature of the European political process, at least since 1979, since the direct elections to the European Parliament. But we consider that there is untapped potential and also some challenges that we haven't fixed so far. And I will refer basically to 3. 1, the fact that European elections are too contaminated in a way by the national political circumstances and by the national debates. So more than a truly European election, we have a sum of 27 consecutive national elections. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is the lack of visibility of European political parties. And this is very paradoxical because they are, according to the Maastricht Treaty, the main actors of European politics. So they are not informal associations of national parties. They are constitutionalized since the Maastricht Treaty. But when it comes to the campaigns and to the actual voting moment, these European political parties are nowhere to be seen because you don't see their image, their logos, their names in the political campaign before the elections. And certainly you don't see them in the ballots, which is also quite paradoxical. No? When you are going to vote for European elections, you only find the national parties in the ballots. And the third challenge is, well, there is a fourth, but the third one is also the lack of proper visibility and understanding and interiorization by the voters of the so-called Spitzenkandidaten process. As you know, since 2014, the main European political families table candidates for President of the Commission. This has been done in 2 occasions with unequal results. In 2014 it worked, in 2019 it didn't work as well. However, this is, we have to admit, I think, basically, it's a very important development. I will, first of all, acknowledge that this is something that has been an innovation in European politics since 2014, but it is too much of an insider's game. It's something that is known and understood by the players here in Brussels, but certainly not by the general population. Because, again, these candidates are not visible in the national campaigns, and they are not visible in the ballot either, or they are visible in one ballot, in the one corresponding to their member states of residence, but certainly not across the Union. So we have these three issues, and then we can add the question of participation, the question of the turnout. This is something that has had a descending line overall until 2014, when for the first time it didn't decrease, but it did not increase. And then in 2019, for the first time, increased. But of course, we are not very high in terms of turnout. So what we have proposed from the Parliament, with this I conclude, is, we can try to provide a solution for these three, maybe also the fourth problem, which is to set up a pan-European electoral constituency made up, hola Sandro, he knows a lot about this also, in which we propose this constituency, which is to be added to the national constituencies, the current ones, made up of 28 candidates. And of course, these candidates have to be presented in a list by the European political parties. And it is only natural to expect that the number one person in this second ballot, this additional ballot, will be the candidate for President of the Commission of the respective European political party. So we believe that then we can, at least over and above the national dynamics of the campaign, to have a pan-European debate, because you will have 28 candidates that will have to campaign across the Union, because that list needs to get votes everywhere, not only in one member state, obviously. And they will have to campaign on issues of common interest, from Helsinki to Lisbon, on migration, on digital, on security, on pandemics, on climate change, topics that are of common interest. Second, the European political parties will be visible because obviously their names and logos will be by nature or by default the ones featuring in the ballots, as it is only normal. And third, we make more visible and realistic the Spitzenkandidaten process, because we have the candidates on top of the list. As Sandro Gozzi always say, you cannot have a Spitzenkandidaten if there is no list, because a Spitzenkandidat means top of the list, no?
No list, no head of the list.
No list, no head of the list. No?
Thank you very much, Dominic, and also welcome to the Honourable MEP Sandro Gozzi. It's now my pleasure to hand over the word to the first Vice President, Dr. Ottmar Karas, who is a fellow Austrian, staunch European, and he has been in the European Parliament since 1999, and was the first time Vice President already in 2012. Dr. Karas, first Vice President, please, the floor is yours.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable members, dear Dominic de Weser, Honorable Chairperson, dear Armin Rabic, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. First of all, thank you for your invitation and congratulations to your initiative. I am pleased to welcome you in the European Parliament, in the heart of our European democracy. I think we have to realize on the beginning, the members of the European Parliament represent more citizens than the US Congress or the US Senate. We have more voters at the election 2024 as Northern America has inhabitants. So we are representing the only one multinational parliament in the world with direct elected members and with legislative power. That is unique. The vote for members of the European Parliament next year is a decision in which direction the European Union will go in the next 5 years. Your event takes place 1 year ahead of a major moment for our democracy, the 2024 European elections. We, who campaign for Europe one way or another, politically or institutionally, share the same goal. We want to protect and strengthen our liberal parliamentarian European democracy. Law is broken, values are violated, trust is lost, freedom of speech is restricted in some member states of the European Union. Parliaments are silenced through emergency powers. I think we all agree we cannot take peace, freedom, and our liberal democracy for granted. The ethical, moral progress of the last decades is not a law of nature. What one generation has achieved can get lost by the next. We have many examples in these days. Therefore, we must do everything to strengthen these, our achievements. For this, we need above all 3 things. First, a common understanding about liberal parliamentary democracy. Second, the political will to implement this commitment in our daily work. And third, accompanying support from the civil society. To unite these objectives, I have recently launched the initiative to develop a charter on the role of parliaments in a functioning liberal democracy. About a common understanding, the fundamental principles and the key ingredients of modern parliamentarism. Just last week, I have presented 7 fundamental principles of liberal parliamentary democracy at the high-level Global Parliamentarism Conference in León in Spain. Before the European elections 2024, all the parliaments of the European Union want to further develop and adopt this common charter latest in April next year, before the election on the 21st of April in Madrid. But it is not enough. We also need civil society action. The EU is all of us. We are all jointly responsible for our common future. Therefore, your project, supported by the EU budget, is so important. I think it is crucial now more than ever to deepen our cooperation, to argue, to justify, and to support and strengthen our values. We should not be afraid to stand up for what makes us unique. We should not kneel before every criticism, but seek public debate. And we should encourage citizens to vote their parliaments in all elections. After all, it is the composition of parliaments that contributes to shaping politics. In this spirit, I wish you lots of success for your project and a fruitful discussion and an efficient role in the European elections campaign everywhere for the European Parliament election 2024. Thank you very much for your interest, your engagement, and your political will to help us. Thank you.
It is now my pleasure to hand over the word to Honourable Member of the European Parliament, Sandro Gossi, who is a member of the Renew Group representing France. And most importantly, he has been the rapporteur on the IMCO group on political advertising regulation. Sandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here with you and with two estimate colleagues like Otmar Karas and Dominique Ruiz de Veza. Because it is clear that what we have to do in this historical phase is three things concerning democracy. The first thing is to develop European democracy. And to develop European democracy, we have tabled several proposals. You have just listened to one, the most important one, I would say, on the electoral law. The second is to mobilize around the democratic processes in Europe and notably around the European elections. And to mobilize, we need several instruments. And one of the answers to mobilize is also our proposal on political advertising and our proposals to increase the transparency of the political and democratic processes across the continent, not only at the European elections, because our regulation will apply to all the different elections. The third word is protect. We need to protect our democracies because our democracies today are under attack, are under threat. And these are the three main reasons behind our proposal to introduce for the first time in Europe some common rules on political advertising. It's clear that this is also linked to a paradox. We talk about European Parliament, we talk about European democracy, we talk about European elections, but you cannot do European and transnational campaigns. Because you got, not only for political reasons, and not only because you got 27 separate, sometimes too separated, political spaces. And our proposal for the transnational list, for example, is one of the answers to put down these walls of national politics. But also because for the rules, if you are a candidate and you want to promote, or if you are a member of European political party, I had the honor to be the secretary of one European political party, and you want to develop, to sign a contract to promote campaigns across the 27 countries, so you can't. You have to do 27 different contracts. But when we started the process in 2014, they couldn't do. I mean, at the time we had a problem with Facebook. You couldn't go to see the Facebook office in Brussels, sign a contract and promote a transnational campaign, sending across the continent the same messages. So you understand that this is also from the single market perspective, from the digital single market perspective, and from our digital innovation strategy, which is based mainly on the digital service sector, is something that we need to tackle. It's something that doesn't make sense. It's something unacceptable. And this is why the political advertising proposal is based on two pillars. On one side, you got the democracy package pillar, the democracy action plan. And on the other side, you got the digital service sector. These are two horizontal political and legislative initiative bases. On this basis, we have inserted a new vertical regulation, a new vertical proposals, which is political advertising, which wants to answer to both challenges. Building a truly digital single market for online political advertising, but also for offline political advertising, introducing rules which mobilize better, ensure more transparency, and protect our democracies.
Thank you very much, Honourable Sandro Gossi, for shedding light in ongoing political reforms at the European level, which will most likely impact the European Parliament elections next year. Before we go into the introduction about what is SEEEDS and invite the webinar rapporteurs to present briefly the recommendations, I would like to also welcome Ignacio Corrao, honourable member of the European Parliament and member of the Green Group and the AFR Group, and we have had the pleasure to work together on EU election observation mission. But I also would like to welcome Antonella Falmorbida, Secretary General of ALDA, and also the President of the European Partnership for Democracy for the past 6 years. And we will go then, after the rapporteurs, to the panel discussion, and we'll try to understand better what will be able to be achieved ahead of the European Parliament elections in terms of reforms. Now, the supporting engagement in European elections and democratic societies project, in short SEEEDS, is aiming at raising awareness about the European elections and bridging the gap between active European citizens and European decision makers. I make it short now because we're already running a bit late, and I hand over now to Michael Lidauer from the Election-Watch.EU to highlight the recommendations of the first webinar, which was on inclusion and equality.
Honourable representatives, it's my pleasure to deliver a few speaking points on equality and inclusion in the European elections. The European Parliament elections comprise of 27 different elections, resulting in one representative body. While an overall legislative framework is in place at the European level, each member state looks to its own electoral system and administration to carry out the elections. As we know, this results in a variance of rights, rules and procedures, ranging from voter and candidate eligibility to electoral calendars, election days and voting methods. Thus, conditions for electoral participation vary considerably between the member states. The ongoing term of the European Parliament is the third in a row during which dedicated committees have prepared proposals to amend the European Elections Act, and MEPs have voted overwhelmingly to adopt agreed changes, including progressive ideas like voting at the age of 16. However, these proposals have repeatedly been rejected by the EU member states in the European Council. It appears that there is a lack of common ground that member states can agree on when it comes to electoral reforms. As civil society, we appeal to the respective authorities, including the Presidency of the Council, the European Parliament and the European Commission, to find common ground for European electoral reforms and to join together with civil society to work on possible opportunities in the remaining period prior to the coming elections. Past electoral processes have sought to alleviate the obstacles faced in particular by women candidates. And while progress has been made and the numbers of women among MEPs have steadily increased, some member states still lag behind. Cyprus, for example, does not have a single woman representative. Further mechanisms should be considered to enhance overall women participation. A new and global phenomenon that concerns women candidates more than men is gendered hate speech online. This should be addressed as a priority. There is also still room for improvement for particular groups of voters ahead of the next elections, for example, mobile European citizens, as well as for voters with disabilities, for whom there are remaining barriers in electoral participation. While legal barriers mostly affect those with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, millions of voters suffer from practical barriers, ranging from the physical accessibility of the voting process to the accessibility of relevant information. Several EU member states still deny the right to vote to persons under legal guardianship. And other member states have no alternative in-person voting mechanisms. At the same time, we have seen that where special inclusion measures are undertaken, all voters can benefit. The 2019 elections saw a record increase in turnout. However, the rise was unevenly shared between the member states. For example, Croatia, Czechia, Slovakia, or Slovenia remained below 30%. This illustrates that turnout should not be taken for granted. Measures are still needed over the period of next year to reach out, in particular, to young and first-time voters to raise their interest to participate in the European elections. One civil society proposal to raise youth interest in taking part has been to provide opportunities for citizen election observation, which in itself creates benefits for the electoral process at large. Non-partisan citizen election observation constitutes independent oversight and provides constructive recommendations for further improvement of electoral processes. However, legislation across the EU member states varies also here, as both international and citizen election observation are only partly allowed. To overcome double standards in respect of EU foreign policy instruments, we suggest that electoral reforms at European level and in the member states also include provisions for international and citizen election observation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's now my pleasure to give the word to Fernando Hortal Foronda. He's the Digital Policy Advisor of EPD, and he will talk about the protection of human rights in political advertising online.
Probably a couple introductory points before going to the conclusions of the webinar that was held as part of SEEEDS on this file. First, it's probably an interesting regulation for as much as it does not regulate elections as such directly, but instead it's, as Sandra was actually discussing, an internal market regulation which seeks to mainstream the protection of fundamental rights and democracy at the very same time that free and fair elections are not a fundamental right within the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. So this looks a little bit more like trying to protect the founding values of Article 2 of the treaties through a regulation on the internal market, which is indeed innovative, and probably one of the greatest legacies of this file will be this approach that was taken. On top of this, political ads is also a very complex file. It builds upon regulations on advertising, such as the Audiovisual Media Directive, a lot of regulation that already exists on data protection in the EU, from the GDPR, e-privacy directive, DSA, DMA, as well as on the platform regulation and advertising on the DSA. It builds upon them at the same time that these regulations are very dynamic yet. Only this morning we have a new proposal on how to implement the GDPR by Commissioner Reinders, and we have a ruling by the European Court of Justice that apparently, still to read it, resignifies various parts of the GDPR. So we're trying to build on top of regulations and directives that are themselves not certain yet and open to interpretation. The main points that most of us in civil society have typically agreed with, which overlap very much with the position of Parliament regarding to the political advertising file, might be 5. First of all, political is political, advertising is advertising. We should not, for the purpose of seeking greater data protection or greater transparency, twist the meaning of what is political and try to capture under the label of political things that are eminently not. And most importantly, we should not try to resignify advertising. Whenever someone's paying or offering anything equivalent to remuneration in order to have their message displayed, published, disseminated, this should be considered advertising. If we go down the road of regarding any public message as advertising, we risk severely restricting the freedom of speech of citizens, and the ability of political parties and civil society organizations to engage in civic discourse. Second, I will necessarily overlap with MEP Gozzi on various points, but indeed, there's a broad agreement within civil society as well as in Parliament. This was voted with more than 500 MEPs voting in favor to restrict the use of personal data to those personal data subjects that us provide willingly and proactively to platforms, not on any information that online platforms might figure out about us. Most interesting, probably from the point of view of election observation and guaranteeing the integrity of elections, another point of contention is whether repositories, real-time, comprehensive repositories of political advertising will exist only for political ads that are run over very large online platforms, the likes of Google Search, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, or whether this will be extended to other platforms and to all online platforms. So essentially that we have transparency on any political ad that is run online in Europe. The last conclusion from our webinar was the interplay with previous regulation will be key. Whereas this regulation does not really set up due diligence rules, that DSA does. So the interplay with the DSA will be essential to ensure that the political ads regulation works.
Thank you very much, Fernando. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Tatjana Hilscher-Begusevic, who is here on behalf of EBDE to talk about how to improve political and campaign finance regulation. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Armin. So in my intervention, I'd like to present some of the reform suggestions and recommendations indeed around the principle of accountability, which is another key quality of a democratic electoral process and is a shared value across the EU. It is obviously called for in a number of areas when conducting elections, including political party and campaign financing, which is what I would like to specifically focus on. In this area, accountability refers to oversight and enforcement mechanisms that aim to hold electoral contestants, actors to account in case of any non-compliance with applicable regulations, be it at the level of EU or national level regulations. So when it comes to the current situation in this area, what we are effectively seeing is that there are 27 separate national political and campaign finance systems, which mostly regulate the activities of national political parties. And obviously there is a EU-level regulation, which pertains mostly to EU political parties. These two systems really come into interplay with one another every 5 years, but with very limited interaction. The financing of European Parliament election campaigns remains largely a national matter. At the same time, there are often very clear legal barriers for the European political parties to spend money in member states during EP elections. And this is exactly what is contributing to this lack of visibility for the European parties that MEP Ruiz de Vesa was talking about. First of all, there is a need to remove the gap, what we talked about, between the European regulations of European political parties and national regulations of national political parties, especially for the aspects that are cross-border in nature. It is also necessary to consider indeed how to eliminate the barriers that exist that prevent European political parties from participating in national European Parliament election campaigns. What is still possible to do ahead of the next elections, in my view, has to do with the role that EU could continue to assume as a leader in research, in coordination, and in promotion of good practices. Firstly, EU could continue to lead in researching into and in developing regulations on the new challenges that are transnational and overarching in nature, and to develop accessible public information materials on them. Secondly, it could use its convening power to support network building and improved coordination among member state institutions, oversight bodies. So a network of oversight bodies could be established to facilitate an exchange of good practice, to ensure uniform and consistent application of EU regulations, but also to help deal with any transnational issues, such as enforcement of cross-border violations, for example. Finally, EU authority could also take the lead in developing digital reporting and data analysis tools that could facilitate oversight, specifically in this area, and ensure due public access to this information. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tanya. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Dennis Wenzel from Democracy Reporting International. He will talk about risks and opportunities, and especially on how to counter disinformation and safeguard the rule of law principles.
Thank you, Chair. Dear honourable members, as you can imagine, a webinar on risks and opportunities on the European elections offers a wide field for discussion. And so for time's sake, I tried to focus on the main risks and the main opportunity. Main risk that was identified is disinformation. And one of the biggest opportunities that was identified in our webinar was creating or communicating to a European police, basically. So therefore, we recommend to strengthen free and independent media, to protect journalists, human rights activists, and civil society organizations, to counter restrictions by foreign agents legislation, slaps, physical threats, and intimidation, to counter media capture and biased reporting. Second, we recommend to stimulate policy debates on topics important to European voters and encourage democratic participation while balancing the attention to anti-European narratives and far-right parties in the elections to support voter engagement and a positive vision of the EU as a project. Thirdly, we think it is important to improve communication around the EU institutions' activities in the fight against disinformation and to raise awareness about the sources and the quality of information for citizens. Fourth, to support the creation of stronger systems by civil society, media and academia to monitor and counter disinformation in EU and EU member states' domestic context. Not only disinformation coming from outside, but also the internal EU debate has to be monitored for disinformation. Fifth, it is important to strengthen the EU's perception and public opinion as solution provider and inform citizens more about its activities and functioning. This was very well illustrated during the first attempts of the support for Ukraine during the COVID crisis and similar examples. Lastly, on the rule of law, I think it's important to respond decisively to the undermining of the rule of law in member states, as the rule of law weaknesses may affect election integrity in, for example, election appeals and the ratification of election results through courts that might be politically staffed. Thank you for your attention.
That was these were the rapporteurs from the SEEEDS webinars, which took place from January to April this year. It is now my great pleasure to hand over to Ignacio Corrao. He's the MEP from Greens and EFA Group.
I would start with one of the most important complicated matter for us, so how to make young people protagonists in the electoral process. I have to say that as a political group, I'm a representative of the Greens EFA, we try a lot to improve new tools to engage with young people with digital, for example, and communication tools and events focused on areas where young people can be attracted or interested. There is a lot to do, for example, with the digital platforms and social media, providing them with relevant and engaging content on the electoral process. Then we need to encourage parties and candidates to address youth-specific European concerns and interests during their campaigns that can help create a sense of relevance and involvement among young voters. By implementing these strategies, the European Parliament can enhance youth engagement and promote their active participation in the democratic process. It is no secret that young people have historically been underrepresented in elections, often feeling disillusioned and disconnected from the political sphere. However, it is essential that we recognize the immense potential they hold and the unique perspectives they bring to the table. It is our duty as European Union elected representatives to make the participation on the European Union election easier for 11 million mobile EU citizens residing in a member state of which they are not national to vote and to stand as a candidate under the same condition. This is why I would like to begin by acknowledging the significant efforts made by my group colleague, Damian Boselager, who took the lead as a rapporteur in the Committee of Constitutional Affairs on the report on the matter. Indeed, Boselager's reports on electoral rights of mobile union citizens in the European Parliament elections was adopted with 500 votes in the February plenary of this year. The report highlights, among others, the barriers faced by young people living abroad in the European Union in engaging in the political process. And it also emphasizes the importance of accessibility for individuals with disabilities, both in digital platforms and physical polling stations.
Thank you, Ignazio, and a pleasure having you here. It's now my great pleasure to hand over to Antonella, who is an expert in participatory democracy, and we would like to hear, especially from her as a strong civil society activist, about how best to bridge the gap between European decision makers and the civil society and active European citizens. Antonella, please.
Thank you very much. Just a few points responding to these questions and to the debate today. We said that European politics takes place here in this house, and we had MEPs taking the floor today, but it doesn't start here. It starts very far from here. And whatever are the challenges in this wall, those who are going to cast the vote, they are not here, they are out there. So when we talk about changing European politics, it's not only here, it's also there. And this is what organizations like mine, ALDA, the European Association for Local Democracy, and also EPD, which represents a broad consortium and partnership of democracy supporters, are aware of. So, and this is what Armin suggests me to talk about, how to make sure that the importance of the European Parliament elections in the past and now are also perceived out there. The challenges and the importance of voting and expressing their vision and their proposal. I think that the next European Parliament elections will be extremely important and extremely difficult. So my message, and I will conclude because I know that I have very little time, is that we need to create citizens interested in deliberation. And what we do in ALDA is to work at the local level, basically one-to-one. And basically in each school, in each local governments, to be able to build what is our European citizenship. And this is multifaceted. And this is also what EPD somehow is doing together with us. So democracy is holistic. It tackles freedom of press, it tackles multi-party, it tackles accountability, it also deals with the fair and free elections. So I think that we need to be high in our thoughts and our strategy, so changing the European electoral law, what our MEPs are doing here, and changing the rule of the game to make it more functional. This is what we want. But on the other hand, we don't have to be afraid to work in the micro. So in our communities, in our municipalities, in our civil society groups, and to make people bring them back to the trust in political affairs.
Thank you very much, Antonella, for this motivating speech. We're running close to the end. We have, I would say, another 10 minutes, and I would now ask our hosting MEP, Honorable Dominic Ruiz de Vesa, to conclude the discussion and the panel, and then hand over to my colleague, Ken Godfrey, who's the Executive Director from European Partnership for Democracy. Dominic, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Armin, and thank you also, of course, to to Sandro Gozzi and to Ignazio Corrado and Antonella for their contributions, and of course all the rapporteurs that spoke before. And I think maybe the difficulty is that we have like a very rich agenda for action. No? There are so many things that we can do to improve European democracy in the electoral dimension, of course, because I liked when Otmar Karas before referred so many times in the intervention to European parliamentary democracy. And of course, parliamentary democracy or liberal parliamentary democracy has many dimensions, has the electoral dimension. This is the one that we have focused the most today, has also the dimension of ensuring proper deliberation, the proper role of parliaments, no? Because we have also experienced the rise of the executive power, no? Across the world, also in Europe. And then we have also the participatory dimension that we have also emphasized from the European Parliament with the Conference on the Future of Europe, the citizens panels, and so on. So it's a really wide agenda, the local dimension, of course, of democracy. So it's, we want to really make this European democracy richer and more inclusive. In the electoral day, I think we are focusing, and you are focusing on the right elements. We are continuing the work. Sandro Gozzi told me that he thinks the political advertisement file can be concluded under the Spanish presidency. We are also putting pressure to open negotiations on our electoral law. We have made progress also on these directives on mobile citizens. And we are also, I think, going to conclude under the Spanish presidency the file on European political parties and foundations, which is also very, very important. And there are also sometimes inconsistencies because the regulation doesn't separate ordinary financing from electoral financing. So we are making progress, but we have many more things to do. So we need you to continue feeding us the right and the good ideas.
Thank you, Dominic. You summarized it nicely up, and we feel there are a lot of questions to be raised and to be followed up by us as well. And we from Election-Watch.EU, we are doing and contributing this comparative research throughout the EU member states, and we are also advocating for electoral reforms, and will be working hand in hand with you and the European Parliament on that ahead of the European Parliament elections. Now, I ask Ken Godfrey, he is the Executive Director of the European Partnership for Democracy, to sum up the key points of today's discussion, and then I think we can go for coffee and debate in a more informal way with all of us.
Thanks very much, Armin. I think MEP Ruiz de Vesa just summarized things very well, but let me just add a couple of things. So just to be very quick, we've mentioned a number of risks and a number of opportunities. And we've also mentioned that there's a lot of things that are being done. In the context of the risks, we mentioned disinformation. We mentioned the gaps between national law and European law, very significant ones. We mentioned legal barriers within member states. So, for example, persons with disabilities, but also to actually observe elections for citizen observers or international observers. We also mentioned harassment, so physical barriers to certain underrepresented groups and their ability to vote and contribute to elections. And finally, it wasn't mentioned for most of the discussion, but it was mentioned at the very end. And I think it's a very key point. Do people care enough? And I think that that's a really important thing at European level. And it gets to what Antonella was saying about engaging people outside of the elections. They need to care enough to want to vote and to have their voice beyond voting for people who reject the European idea in general. And when it comes to opportunities, I'll just mention two. One is harmonization. We mentioned political advertising. We mentioned on European political parties and foundations, mentioned on election observation. And the second is engagement. So getting people engaged, young people, mobile citizens, we mentioned voting age, we mentioned civil society organizations, we also mentioned media actors being engaged, and all of those will need to be supported, mobilized in order for turnout to hopefully increase again, and particularly increase in those countries that Michael mentioned where turnout was still below 30%. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
In my summary, but I'm glad that you mentioned it, the question of electoral observation, I forgot, it's very important. I think we need to have a European framework also for electoral observation, because we know elections are conducted in very different ways, and they can be improved with the feedback from let's say, peer-to-peer or external electoral observation conducted, not just, I mean, I think it's good to have OSCE missions, but I think European Union can also develop a framework.
Thank you very much, and let's have coffee together. And thanks for your participation and interest.